Today we're talking about physical and virtual servers and why you would choose one over the other. At the end of the day, as a business owner, as somebody in the IT industry, you always want to be keeping costs down while keeping productivity up, making sure that your systems can be recovered as well in the event of a disaster. So this is an example of what a physical server infrastructure would look like. Physical servers have been around for a very long time. In the olden days, there was no really such thing as a virtual server. They were all physical. Every single server that you would have would be a physical server. In this case, I've got an example here of 4 physical servers. One is hosting a domain controller and DNS. The other one is a mail server, perhaps something like Exchange. I've got a file server, which all of my files are sitting on. And I've got a database server, which could be used for multiple databases. Now, this seems like a very good model, but you've got to consider that this is a high cost model in the sense that I've got to have a physical server for each individual application or each individual service that I'm wanting to provide to the business. Of course, the advantage of having physical servers is that they're physically there, they are dedicated, and I can go in and upgrade them, and they are dedicated for one individual service. But they do fail in the area of redundancy. There is actually no redundancy built in out of the box for physical servers. As well as that, thinking about costs, we're talking about things like electricity and physical rack space as well. These servers have to physically sit somewhere. They have to be powered, they have to be cooled by air conditioning units. So if you consider all of those options, the cost of physical servers is generally going to be higher than if we say look at the alternative, which would be the virtual server infrastructure. If a server does fail, for example, and I've lost my DC, my domain controller, and my DNS, of course I'm going to have services interrupted, but then I have to organize a replacement server, rebuild it, and if it's running something like Windows Server, I have to reconfigure Windows Server, reconfigure my DC and my DNS. I may have to restore from backups, but I'm essentially rebuilding a server. I have to source that server, I have to reconfigure it, rack it, cable it up, reconfigure all of the applications and the software before it's up and operational. Scalability on a physical server is always going to be a bit of a challenge. If I need to upgrade the resources, for example, on my mail server that is running 32 gig of RAM, and I need to upgrade it, I essentially have to power down the server, source the RAM from wherever it may be. I have to wait that amount of time for that RAM to come in. I have to go down to the local IT store and purchase some additional RAM, open it up, put it in, and there you go, right? And then I can bring everything back up and I can upgrade it from 32 to 64 gig. But that amount of time, the amount of effort to do that is quite challenging. If I have to upgrade the CPU, I may be stuck. If I've got 16 cores on 2 CPUs, and then I need more resources, I need to upgrade it or double it to 32, you're going to be in trouble as well. So the scalability of a physical server is a bit of a challenge. So if we compare this to a virtual server infrastructure, unlike the physical where I've got multiple servers hosting different operations, different services, I've got, in this case, a virtual server, I've got one physical server hosting multiple virtual servers. So the physical server in this case could be what's called a hypervisor. There are the big vendors, which are your Citrix and your VMware. Also, Microsoft have their own virtualization technology. Essentially, it's a physical server still running a hypervisor operating system. If we're talking about VMware, for example, VMware's hypervisor is called ESXi. You would install ESXi onto this, and then you would go and configure multiple VMs, virtual machines, within that one server. So now, rather than having multiple pieces of hardware, multiple servers here, I've got the one server hosting multiple VMs. Now, the great thing about this is if I do a comparison, let's say I've got the domain controller in the physical environment here, and it has 8 gig of RAM and it has 1 CPU. If I need to upgrade that, I would have to power those services down, open the box up, procure that additional hardware, and install that additional hardware if I can even upgrade it in the first place. In this scenario, this hardware, this server, has got the resources already built in. So you would go and purchase this hypervisor, this physical server, with enough resources to be able to cater to all of this and then some more intended growth, right? I can easily boost up the RAM, the CPU of any of these directly using the resources from my hardware, from my hypervisor. So essentially a chunk of RAM, let's say this particular server has 64 gig of RAM, physical 64 gig of RAM, I can allocate components of that, 8, 16, 24, 32 gig of RAM, for example, across these virtuals, and it's going to use 32 gig of RAM physical on my physical server. The same with CPU. The CPU can be shared, so I can use the CPU that is on here and share components of it across my virtual servers. Ideally, when you're setting up things like high availability and redundancy, you don't want to have just one physical server here running virtualization technology, because in the case of this, if in the physical world I lost one server, I've lost one server, but other services could still potentially operate. In this scenario, if I lose this physical server, I lose every one of these virtual servers. So what you do is you'd set up multiple, at least 2 physical servers, set them up in redundancy so that they have high availability, so that services can flick between the 2. So I can have a second hypervisor configured. Between them, they're connected. They're what's called highly available, high availability. So there's a technology you can configure so that the 2 servers know about each other, and I can have the servers split across the 2. In the event of a disaster and a physical server died, let's say that server died, right? All of these VMs could be spun up over here. So in this scenario, I lose a server, I'm in big trouble. I can't really get anything up unless I restore it. I have to build a new server, potentially restore the software, restore the backups. In this scenario, I lose a server. I can have everything just spinning up and running on this secondary server right here. So the things you've got to consider when you are looking at physical or virtual and comparisons between the two is really you're starting off with the budget, right? You're starting off with how much is it going to cost me? How much physical hardware do I need? How much is that going to cost me in terms of, procuring the hardware, setting it up, so maintenance, somebody physically going out and maintaining it and building the server. Consider your disaster recovery and business continuity. In any business, you want to make sure that services are operational as often as possible, and that in the event of a disaster, in the event of something going wrong, you can restore operations as quickly as possible. Restoring operations in this model is much easier and much more timely. Like, you can actually restore things in a much quicker fashion. So remember that if you lost a server in this environment, that server needs to be rebuilt. In this environment, you lose it. If you've got high availability configured, it just spins up and runs on here, and you potentially have no to little outage. Performance is the other consideration. Purchasing some hardware for your physical server, then purchasing a hypervisor and adequately speccing out your virtual servers, you can have adequate performance right now. Down the track, as your server requires better performance, or you need to improve the performance, it's more challenging to do that on the physical side than it is on virtual. On virtual, you can just literally spin up that VM and just give it more CPU, more RAM. Let's say you need to migrate services, you're changing offices, or you're running an older operating system and you need to migrate services from one to a newer operating system, for example. Whatever that scenario may be, migration of virtual servers is considerably easier than migration of a physical server. In the scenario of here, if I need to move servers from one to another, I literally can just move them on the fly from this host to this host. I can procure a new piece of server infrastructure, physical server infrastructure, and set it up here. And if I need to move VMs from here to here, it's literally, once that's all configured, I just right click on it and I can move it on the fly from one to the other. I can't really do that on the physical infrastructure. So really, in summary, physical, you're going to have physical pieces of hardware, physical servers running multiple different types of applications, while in a virtual infrastructure, you can literally commission one or more physical servers running hypervisor technology and then have multiple virtual servers running within it.